Minnick, and today I'm going to be talking to you and showing you some things on the topic of getting practical with React. So my idea behind this webinar is that a lot of React introduction classes and videos often skip over the kinds of best practices and practical tips that can make coding with React easier. And also there's been a lot of change in the way people think about React in the last year or so, and I want to talk about that and kind of show some of the latest thinking on how to organize and build React applications. So in this webinar, I'm going to be covering some of the things that I've learned and some of the ways that React actually works and is used in the real world. But before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about myself and about Wintellect. Since you're here, I assume that you're somewhat familiar with Wintellect, but you may only be familiar with one of the things that Wintellect does. Wintellect is known for consulting and training. We have instructor-led training as well as on-demand training through Wintellect Now, which is our online subscription-based video service. Wintellect is a Microsoft Gold certified partner and has been Microsoft's #1 training vendor for over 15 years. In addition to our expertise with .NET and Windows, we also have expertise in many other areas like cloud, DevOps, data, artificial intelligence, and web and mobile development, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. Wintellect's founders are industry influencers and have written over 30 books combined, including some of these titles right here. And if you stick around to the end of this webinar, we have some special offers. I'm not going to address this slide right now, but for those who are in the audience, those of you in the audience who stay to the end, I will show this again. And if you're interested, you can contact Martha Guerin. I'm Chris Minnick. I'm an author and trainer. I specialize in web and mobile web development. I've written several books, including JavaScript for Dummies, HTML and CSS for Dummies, JavaScript for Kids, and around 10 others. I have 20 years of experience as a full stack web developer, which means that I work on both the back end and front end. I also work on mobile apps, and lately I've been working in Vue and React primarily. I've been a trainer for over 10 years. I specialize in JavaScript, React, other JavaScript frameworks, and I also write courses on these topics. So let's get into it. React is a library for building user interfaces. Chances are you know that much already, but what I want to do before I get too far into this is just put up a poll so I can find out what your level of experience with JavaScript and with React in particular are. So we'll start out with the JavaScript poll. Okay, so I'm seeing about half and half. About half of you are fairly experienced with JavaScript or very experienced with JavaScript, and the other half are maybe new to JavaScript or just haven't used it in a long time. So that's perfect. We're going to be covering a lot of more sort of intermediate to advanced JavaScript, but I think everyone should be able to follow along pretty easily. And so the next poll, we're just going to want to find out about your experience with React. Okay, fantastic. So with about 84% voting, looks like we have little over half are unfamiliar or just starting to get familiar with React or starting to learn it, and then around 33% using it or using it all the time. So there's going to be some good information here. If anything is unclear or if you need further examples or information about any of this, just stop me. I've also got some other webinars that I've done for Wintellect that may be helpful for those of you who are in need of more information about JavaScript or about React, and I'll give the links to those as we get to certain points in this presentation. A very quick review of React here. React was created by Facebook. It's a library that's open source and currently used by very many thousands of developers to do both web and mobile front-end user interfaces. React, in short, makes composable web components. So it allows you to use JavaScript modules to create parts that you can assemble to display user interfaces. And it has very optimized ways of updating those user interfaces in response to events, such as users inputting data or new data coming from a backend. And so the benefit of React is that it has these composable components that can be updated and rendered very quickly. And this is a very brief description of how React works. It's actually pretty simple, but it uses JavaScript to implement web components. So these are pieces of the user interface that can be assembled together and reused. And these components are rendered using a virtual DOM. So this is an in-memory representation of the user interface, is where most of the calculation takes place in React. And then it minimizes the amount of direct changing to the web browser's state, which results in performance increases. These components are updated in response to changes to the application state. We have a state object in React, which controls whether the application is updated, and updates to the virtual DOM are applied to the actual DOM using a separate library. For web browsers called React DOM. For native applications, we use React Native. And so this is just a very, very quick overview of React. I have an introduction to React webinar, which you can check out if you want to review React in more detail. But my plan in this webinar is to talk about some of the pitfalls, tips, and best practices in React development. And then I'm going to demonstrate how to improve an existing React application. So I'll be showing you a React application that maybe is optimized according to best practices from 3 years ago. And I'm going to be updating that to React best practices for today. React is actually a really lightweight library. There's not much to it. The slide I showed a couple of slides ago describing web components and state, that's really all there is to React for the most part. If you are looking for a more heavy-handed framework that gives you a lot of guidance on how to do things, you probably should look at more like something like Vue or Angular. React gives you a lot of flexibility in how you work, and you can adapt React to your stack, to your tools, and to your company's style. But the flip side of that is that you have a lot of flexibility, and React doesn't enforce best practices. So it's really up to developers to discover or create their own best practices for how to do things. But the key to really being good with React is to understand JavaScript. So things like the new ES6 syntax and using constructors inside of JavaScript classes, knowing the difference between using the function keyword and an arrow function, knowing when to bind functions and set how to determine what the value of this is in a function or inside of a class, and knowing in React where your state should live. These are all things that you can, if you have a good understanding of JavaScript, you're going to be able to do these things really well and be able to work with React a lot more easily. So my first tip with learning and using React correctly is to know JavaScript well. Know how scope works in JavaScript, know how modules work, know what prototypal inheritance is and how that's different from object-oriented class-style inheritance. Understand functions, both with the functions keyword and arrow functions, and be really proficient with the new JavaScript syntax. So there's been a new version of JavaScript every year since 2015, and these are now named according to the year. So we've had 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and now 2019. You can follow this link right here to see my webinar that I did on learning JavaScript and learning the new JavaScript syntax. And if you're not real familiar with JavaScript or you haven't used JavaScript in the last 5 years or so, I highly recommend checking out this webinar. There are some best practices in JavaScript that I recommend using and that most people today recommend using. And these are a few of them. There is in ES 2015 a new const keyword for creating constant variables and a let keyword for creating block scoped variables. And it's best practice today to only use these two and never use the var keyword, which is the old function scoped keyword that was originally put into JavaScript and was your only option for creating variables up until 2015. You can do everything you need with const and let, and it's a lot safer than using var. You should use a linter. Currently, the one that's used by most people is ESLint. You should name variables and functions in JavaScript using camelCase. In React, we'll name components using starting with uppercase letters. But variables and functions in JavaScript, typically we name using camelCase. Statements in JavaScript should always end with semicolons. Most JavaScript interpreters, compilers will still process your JavaScript correctly if you don't end your statements in semicolons, but there's always a chance that they won't, and it's just safer to always end your statements with semicolons. When you're writing functions in JavaScript, put your opening braces at the end of the line before opening the body of the block. So in this example here, we have a function. This is an example of an arrow function, and there's always a debate about whether that opening curly brace goes in the next line or goes in the same line with the name of the function. Most people will tell you that the correct way to do it in JavaScript is to put your opening curly brace there on the same line. And then you're going to be seeing in React that there is a return value which determines what will be displayed and rendered in the browser. And it's a best practice in React to always use parentheses around that return value. Just as with the semicolons, you'll see a lot of people who don't use those parentheses, but there's no reason not to, and it does kind of makes things a little safer and a little neater if you do. If you get into doing a lot of React development, you'll find that React developers are really fond of using these sort of cool JavaScript tricks. And at first glance, when you see these, you may think, what is that? And some of it's always the newest JavaScript syntax gets used and then sort of spreads through the React community. And people who maybe aren't completely up to speed with JavaScript will have to figure out what's going on. And so I wanted to just sort of cover a few of these tricks so that when you encounter them, you'll know what's going on. And they can be really helpful, save you some time and some shortcuts. So the first one I want to talk about is using the logical AND to do conditional rendering. So in this example here, we have, we're saying unread messages.length is greater than 0, and then we use the logical and then after that have what renders. And so the idea here is that if there are unread messages, then you want to display a message. And the way this works is that if you have a false expression plus any other expression, that always results in false. But if you have a true expression, so if unread messages.length is greater than 0 plus any other expression, it returns the second expression. And so this is a shortcut for doing an if-then, and you can use this in the return method of React. And you may see this, and that's what's going on here. Object destructuring can save you some typing. And so instead of declaring variables separately inside of the return method of a React component, or saying this.props.model and this.props.title, you can now use this object destructuring syntax to create individual constants or variables in one line right here. And so this line uses the curly braces around the variable names that you want to use, and then you can destructure the this.props object to pull out model and title and create separate variables. And then I'll be showing some other JavaScript tips as I get into the demo portion of this webinar. But now I'm going to move on to just some random React development tricks and tips that I've found to be useful. These are in no particular order, but I think put together, a lot of them are really helpful. So my tip number 2 for React development, tip number 1 was no JavaScript. Tip number 2 is to use Create React App. This started as a way to just quickly spin up a boilerplate application for doing demos or for learning React, but it's really become an essential part of doing React development. And everyone I know begins their projects using Create React App now. And what Create React App does is it installs a lot of local packages, all the tools that you need for doing React development, including React, React DOM, development server, Webpack, Babel, your testing framework, ESLint, all these things that in the early days of React development we were installing separately, and there were a lot of different boilerplate development environments for React. Now we use Create React App, which really installs a really good development environment for doing React, creates a very simple project, and it can be used extremely easily just by, let's see. Going into your terminal and doing npx create react app and then the name of the project you want to do. And rather than installing, configuring things like Webpack, Babel, a testing framework, ESLint, and all of that, pretty much now you can just do this, and at the end of it, after about 5 minutes of downloading, you'll have a project that you can get started with, and you'll have your testing framework set up, and everything will just work. so you can worry just about the React. At some point, you are going to need to configure, create React app. You're going to need to do some kind of customization, but that's something you can figure out when the time comes. And although I do still consider it important to know Webpack and know how to configure Webpack and how to customize your linter, I think that create React app is definitely the way to go right now. And so here it's just finishing up, and I'll show just the process of launching this boilerplate application. So now it just says to use cd into test project and then run npm start. And so there it is. It's just a very simple application that you can use to get started. If you need to configure create React app, use npm run eject, and then you can unbundle the tool. It'll unbundle the tools so that you can configure them. React and Facebook do suggest a few best practices for React development, in spite of React being such a lightweight framework that doesn't really offer much in terms of structure. And one of the ways, one of the articles that's sort of key to understanding how to get started with a React project is Thinking in React. And this, you can find this on the React documentation website. And it talks about how to get started building a user interface with React. It suggests starting with a mockup. So this can just be a Photoshop file or a drawing that you look at and decide how to split it up into components. And then step 2 is to build a static version from that mockup. So this is a matter of just making components that pass data down through the hierarchy and but don't have any interactivity at this point. Step 3 of building a user interface is to identify what is state in the application. So what data in your application changes over time and can't be computed based on something else. Step 4, you'll identify where the state should live. So if there are 3 components that all use the same data that comes from a database, you need to have some component at a level higher in the hierarchy that can feed data to those 3 components. And then step 5 is to add event listeners and trigger updating of the stateful data. Another best practice for React development is to name props. So props are the data that's passed from parent to child. Name props from the component's own point of view rather than from the context in which it's being used. So in this example here, we have a component called comment, and we're passing in to a component called avatar. We're passing in the prop called author, but inside of avatar, we're naming that prop user. And so this is just a matter of thinking about components from their own point of view rather than from where you're naming from the context where data is being used. Reusability is also key to React. So if part of your user interface is used several times or is complex enough on its own, it's a good candidate to be a reusable component. setState. The setState method is what determines what's going to update or when your component's going to update. setState is asynchronous, so you may have setState calls being bundled by React, and you don't have any control over when setState calls are made, really. And so you can't rely on the value of this dot state for calculating the next state in your application, unless you pass a function to setState, and then that will cause state and props to be received at the time of the update as arguments. So this is a way to essentially get around this setState being asynchronous and being able to count on the value of this dot state. It's a best practice in React to use composition rather than inheritance. So you might think if you're doing React development, you can use JavaScript classes and extend one component, for example, a dialog component, to make an error dialog. But this is not how React is intended to be used. Rather, in React, we tend to use fewer components and make them more reusable and configurable using props. So the best practice in React is to make a component like dialog and then use props, so data passed from the parent to the child, to configure that dialog to be an error dialog or a different kind of dialog rather than extending it. You should, this is getting a little bit more advanced, but you should avoid passing new closures to subcomponents. So in this case, we have the commented out on change right here, where it's passing a function into the on change prop. A better way to do this is to define a function. For example, it's often named handle change, and then pass that as the value of on change. And the reason is that because if you pass in a function that's a closure inside of the value of the prop, then the new function is being created and passed every time there's a render. So let's talk a little bit about components, and then I want to get into my demo. Components, best practices for components are this idea first. So the components should be focused, independent, reusable, small, and testable. And you can remember this by the first letters of them spell out first. Components in React have changed several times, the way that we create components. So in the beginning of React, there was the react.create class method, and you would pass that a configuration object, and then it would create a React class or a React component. This was deprecated in favor of using ES6 syntax and the class keyword. So you would use this class myComponent extends react.component, and then react.create class was eventually taken out of React. Although you may still see it out there in the wild with a lot of demos and older videos, but react.create class is no longer a part of React by default. The new class method of creating React created some confusion. So using the class keyword meant having to write much more code, and that React itself did even less than it previously did. So instead of React creating components for you, you had to manually do everything. So that includes having a constructor that sets the initial values of the component, and having to bind functions so that to the component inside a constructor, having to set the initial state specifically here, and then you have this new render method which returns something, and it adds up to a whole lot of code that really isn't lending much to your application, but that you have to type for every single component. And so as a result of this, we came up, React introduced the idea of a functional component, which minimizes the use of class components by making these presentational components only that can't hook into the lifecycle of your component, but can be used just for rendering presentation inside of your application. And so here's what a function component looks like. They gave developers a new way to create stateless components by making components be just functions that return some piece of the user interface. And this can be trimmed down even more to just a very simple arrow function, as in the second example. But that created new problems because functions aren't classes. So functional components can't have state, they can't use lifecycle methods, they can't update the state. They were just used for presentation, and some terms that were used for functional components were things like stateless components, stateless functional components, dumb components, presentational components. But the idea was that they can only do data. The function receives data, produces a view. And so you're still left with the need to make class components and mix class components with function components and know when to use function components versus when to use class components until earlier this year when hooks were introduced into React. And hooks provide a way to access more imperative ways of working in React and to access state and reuse behavior between function components. They let you use more of React's features without classes, and I feel like it's possible now to do anything you want to do in React using just function components and hooks. And this makes your code a lot cleaner, and I'm going to show you how to do this in just a minute. But if you want to see my React hooks demo, you can follow this link right here. So wintellect.com/webinar/React hooks. Hooks are functions that let you hook into React state and lifecycle features from function components. And they allow you to reuse stateful logic without changing your component hierarchy. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about organizing React and some of the processes that have been used and what the current thinking is in light of hooks. So one of the earliest and most popular patterns in React is the container pattern. So we use the container pattern to separate state from rendering. So in this example here, we have a component. This is a container component, which its whole purpose is just to fetch the data. So inside of that component did mount method, we're fetching user data and then updating the state. And then this container is returning either a loading component, a loading element, or a render user component, depending on the state of whether it's loading or not. So this is an example of a container. It doesn't actually do the rendering of what's going to be in the web browser, but it controls the rendering through the fetching of the data. And this is still a very popular pattern for React development, and it's used pretty much in every larger React application, larger than just a demonstration. But one of the big problems, whether you're using containers or any other kind of structure in React, is that file structure is constantly changing, and sort of there's trends on different ways to do file structure and what people are doing. By default, when you install Create React App, it just gives you a source directory and throws everything in there. So it looks just like this, where it has CSS, JavaScript, tests, images, all in the same folder. Obviously, this is suboptimal. One of the most common ways to organize a React and Redux application is this one right here, where you have a components directory that contains all of your components, a containers directory that contains all of your containers, and then you have separate folders for Redux actions, Redux reducers, separate file for routes. So this is, you'll probably see 80 to 90% of React applications out there are structured in this way. This is a little bit of an older way now, and I think in general people are finding that this is a little bit difficult to maintain long-term as your application grows. So these days, people are looking at other ways to do things. One of them is to group by features. So in this application here, we have a folder for groups and a folder for users. And each of those has its own actions, components, constants, containers, and reducers. So we're separating by the features of the application rather than just strictly by components and containers. A way that's starting to get traction right now is to separate actions and view-centric layout. So in this one, we're looking at the application as having functionality, which belongs in the modules folder there, and then routes. And so the routes folder here contains different layouts based on different sections of the application, and then those hook into the modules functionality. How we do style in React applications is constantly changing, but now with Create React App and the way it can import CSS documents by default, we've sort of rethunk how to do CSS and styling in React. And the best practice now is just to import CSS files and just use them as CSS inside of your files. And I'll show you that in just a second. Every component should have prop types, and these are just a way of validating the input data types that come into your components. And most importantly, we're rethinking the unnecessary complexity of some React applications, and in particular with Redux. The trend right now in React is towards simplicity and away from over-engineered solutions when they're not necessary. If you've seen Redux applications, they're really big on being complex and having just a lot of setup, which makes your application highly organized, but it also makes it very wordy and difficult to sort of come into and get started with. Hooks can simplify things. And so that brings me to my demo. I'm going to be showing you how to work with this existing React bookstore application that I have here. And this is very simple. When you load it, it loads some data from an API. It has add to cart. When things are in the cart, they're added together, and then you can remove them from the cart by clicking the button a second time. So that's the whole application. And we can see the existing code for it right here. It has this shopping cart application right here. It's structured using components and containers, and it has all of the component files inside of this one directory. And then the container is just app and app test here. Is the test. And then in the app, you can see we have, this is a class-based component. It has constructor, it sets the initial state, binds some functions that do the adding and the removing. It uses component did mount. It has a couple of methods here for getting product data, adding to cart, removing from cart. There's a lot of stuff here. But this is nothing compared to Redux version of the same application that also I have here. And if we look at the Redux version of this, it has actions, components, containers. This is the same functionality, reducers, and it has this, let's see, index.js file. And index.js imports create store, combine reducers, bind action creators, apply middleware, and compose. It imports Redux Thunk, imports provider, connect, action creators, and uses combine reducer to create a root reducer. Somewhere in here, it creates a store with middleware. We make this store here with initial state. We inject the DevTools extension. We have to map the state to the props and then map dispatch to props, and then connecting using a higher order function here to connect the props and the dispatches to the component. And finally, we're rendering it, passing in the store. And it's just a lot of complexity here. But we're not going to deal with the Redux version. We're going to look at this straight JavaScript version or straight React version and convert this into using hooks and to using functional components. So the first thing that I want to do here is change this into a functional component. And I'm going to pause for a minute here and just see if we have any questions very quickly here. Okay, so one, can hooks replace the need for Redux? Yes. And can you post a link to the hooks webinar? Can you use TypeScript in React? Yes, and many people recommend it. And then there's a question about the render method. Okay. So here we're going to start with converting this into a functional component. So I'll start by turning app into a const. And then I'm going to set the value equal to a prop to a function. I'm going to use an arrow function. And then we're going to get rid of the constructor altogether. And instead, oops, this should be props. And I'm going to get rid of this as well, where we're binding the actions. And instead, I'm going to bring in the use state hook. So this allows you to hook into the state of an application or of React's state object from a function component. And so the way to use that is we have our array destructuring, and we're going to create items and set items by calling the use state function, and then we're passing in an empty array as the initial value. And then this also has, we have products, the other part of stateful data inside of this application. So we're going to do the same thing here with products, where we'll create products and a set products method for updating the products. And we're going to set that to an empty array as well. Now this component did mount. This is a function that runs when the component first loads into the web browser. A better way of doing, you can't use lifecycle methods inside functional components. Instead, you have to use the new hook called useEffect. And useEffect will run by default every time the render method of component is called. So we're going to say useEffect, and it takes a function as its first parameter. And inside that function, we're just going to pass all this stuff. And then because this is a functional component, we can't use this.setState anymore. Instead, we're going to use our setProducts method that we have right here to update the value of the product state to the products that are downloaded from this JSON file. So that should take care of our data fetching. But the problem here is that if we run this, this is going to run and do this fetch every single time the component is rendered, which happens every time something changes in the state. So you can pass in a second parameter to use effect, which is a required input to the use effect method. And if you put in just an empty array, then it's only going to do this effect, this fetch, one time when the component first loads. So we'll do that. Next, we want to update these methods to be functional, to be components. Instead of using the class method notation here, we're going to just update these to arrow functions. Like that. And then that should do it. And then add to cart, we'll do the same thing. Const add to cart equals, takes the ID to add, and then here, instead of this .state.items, we're going to just use items. This is the stateful data inside this component, and then add an ID to it. And then instead of this .setState, we're going to use setItems. And we're going to be setting items equal to this new items array, which we constructed right here. Just like that. And then the remove from cart method will do much the same thing. So we'll say const remove from cart equals ID to remove, which is an arrow function. And then we say new items equals, and this is just going to be items.filter, and it's going to remove an ID from there, and then it'll set the state equal to new items. Functional components don't have render, they just have a return value. And so then here we'll set cart items equal to, instead of this .state, we'll say items.map equals ID, and then okay, we just say get product, and then instead of this .state.products, we're just saying products. And then inside of a return, we're almost done there. Here, we can get rid of this, get rid of this. This should just be products, items. Let's see, in cart should be just cart items. So that comes from right here. And then I know that we also need to pass in just the stateful array there. And then that, like that. And so this is this application converted to use a function component, and I think this should just work now. Okay, so I was missing this. I have an extra.
There's a suggestion in the questions area from Olaf.
Okay, let's see. I left one, this .setState. Let's see, is it still there? Yeah, thank you. So this needs to be just changed to use the set items. Great. And there we go. I have some typos. Right there. We're almost there. Line 46, item is not defined. That should be items. So this is almost working. except I think there's probably a problem with fetching the data. So I'm going to just copy my solution file here really quickly, paste it in just to make sure that I'm all right. Whoops. And so in the end, you start this up and something's running on that server. And now I'm going to have the same error because it's trying to fetch data from port 3002. So if I update this, there we go. So now it's working and it's using hooks instead of the old React lifecycle methods and class components. You can go through and you can make this kind of change to all the subcomponents as well. Now to save time, I'll show you just my finished solution here, because we're getting near the end. So in my solution here, I also reorganized according to functions. So I have a cart folder and a cart item folder, product folder, and each of these contains the CSS files and the JavaScript files. I also modified things to just import the CSS and then use the CSS names as the class names. I've converted all of my functions or all of my class components into functional components, and then here I'm using the object destructuring to bring in the props object and then use that inside of each component and the subcomponents. My containers folder still just has app, but things are a bit more organized here inside of the components directory, and I've saved a lot of time and complexity by using function components instead of class components. And I think going forward, this is going to be the way more and more React is done. Hooks are a little bit of magic, and they have, they're maybe a little less transparent than classes, but they are, I think they are really useful, and they make React development easier and definitely easier to get into and to manage complexity with. So quickly here, I'm just going to see if there are more questions here that I can answer right now. There's a question about how to deploy Rails and React Redux applications. So I think that's beyond the scope here. Maybe I'll do, I could do a webinar on that in the future. And let's see. But then, oh, okay, yeah, there was a question here, what's in the products.css.js file? And this is what I replaced from the original application, where I had, this one has CSS written as JavaScript. So these are actually JavaScript styles inside of a module that was being imported into the product list, and then you could use things like style equals styles.product list. It's my opinion now that a better way to do this kind of thing is to just have a plain CSS file like this one here. So that's, everyone knows that's CSS, and then you can just import that using import product list, and then you can use that by just saying class name equals product list. And this simplifies things, it eliminates a lot of confusion, and it's also been argued that browsers are optimized for CSS, they're not optimized so much for modifying styles using JavaScript. So that's another good argument. So now I'm going to close things down here. I have a couple more slides. We have the special offer for attendees of this webinar. So for attending this webinar, you can get a 10% discount on public virtual MOC courses, 10% discount on Microsoft certification roles training. You can get a free cloud briefing or Q&A, and a 10% discount for private on-site training. You can contact Martha Guerin at mguerin@wintellect.com, and she will be happy to help you and answer any questions you have about Wintellect's capabilities or about training. And I'm going to very quickly here see if there are any other questions.
Yeah, there are a couple more for you, Chris.
Let's see. Okay, so the question here, is there a good source for current thinking about best practices for React? I would check, there really isn't a good source, one source. A lot of people post things on Medium. I would also just check out the official React documentation site, and you can get some great information there. And there are some good people on medium.com who are blogging about React. Check them out. React conferences are always a good source for the latest thinking. If you search for React best practices, you'll get some things that are pretty old, some things that are new, but maybe not so great. This one right here, this clean code versus dirty code, I think this is a really good article, just talking about what is clean code, how to write clean code, how to write dry code. And this is just sort of all around good practices for writing code of any kind, but in particular React. And then there are some any good React bloggers you can find pretty easily by looking on the React website. Question here, how can you lift values to parent components? In React, data flows down from parent to child, and then events flow up. So what you do in React is we have props which are passed using these attributes. So in cart here, add to cart, remove from cart. These are data being passed down. But in this case, right here we're destructuring, or we're spreading out this products array here into different pieces of data that are being passed into product, but then we're also passing in these functions. And these functions right here, if you remember, add to cart and remove from cart, are part of what was defined here in your app component. And so when you defined these functions here, you also bound them with the app component. And so so when they're called, they update the data inside of app. So they update, they call set items and set products. And so the way you change data in a parent component from a child component is by calling a function that's bound to the parent. And you can see this in my hooks webinar, as well as in my introduction to React webinar, and I go into this in a lot more detail. And so I think that's about it. Thank you all very much for attending this webinar. This will be archived on the Wintellect site shortly, so you can review it or watch it again. I urge you to check out my other webinars if you have any questions, and thank you very much.